Hi, Firstpresbyterian family. I am pastoral resident Keith Dove, and I am joined today by our Director of Christian Formation, Donna Chase, and our member and session member. Are you an Elder Mary?
I am.
Mary Eagle. We are covering only just a little bit of history today, just 60 or 70 years or so. But welcome to session number 4 of our Deconstructing Racism at FPC, our past, present, and future. If you have been following along this whole time, you know what we're doing. You're probably used to this by now. If you've not been following along, maybe go check out our week 1 video, which will let you know what's actually going on. But this week we will be talking about Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. So basically 1900 to, I think our final thing is 1972. So 72-ish years today. So we'll get it kicked off. Thank you for joining us. And Mary, let us know a little bit about what you've been learning about Jim Crow.
Okay, well, first thing, how did the name Jim Crow come about? Was it a real person? No, it really wasn't. I am going to go back before 1900 because in the early 1830s, there was a white actor by the name of Thomas Dartmouth. His nickname was Daddy. His last name was Rice. And he became famous by performing this minstrel routine as the fictional Jim Crow. And that's where the name came from. And he was the caricature of this clumsy, dim-witted, Black enslaved man. He was the first one to have created this character after witnessing a Black man dancing, and an elderly Black man dancing and singing this tune called Jump, Jim Crow in Louisville, Kentucky. He later turned this persona into a minstrel act where he donned the famous black face that folks would do back in that time. He would perform jokes and sing songs in this stereotypical dialect for the time. And as the show's popularity spread, Jim Crow became a widely used, very derogatory term for Black people. But what was Jim Crow? Well, from post-Civil War to 1968, Jim Crow stood for a legal system that segregated people by race in all kinds of areas such as restrooms, water fountains, hotels, schools, jobs, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants, bus and train stations, pools, hospitals, jails, and most other public accommodations. And the Blacks were also withheld from voting rights. Those who attempted to defy the Jim Crow laws faced arrest and even murder, a violent death at that. The most ruthless organization that came out of the Jim Crow era was the Ku Klux Klan. And that was begun in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, as a private club for Confederate veterans. The KKK did develop into a secret society, terrorizing the Black communities and seeping through white Southern cultures, with members at the highest levels of government becoming members and in the lowest levels of criminal Black alleys. Also out of Jim Crow became lynchings. And there were almost 4,000 lynchings across the South, across the Jim Crow South, to the end of the Reconstruction era. In 1877, this happened. What do you do when you goof? Keep going. There were almost 4,000 lynchings in the Jim Crow South from the end of the Reconstruction era, from 1877 to 1950. The lynchings would occur regularly as the public spectacles after Sunday worship services all through the South. The victims were killed usually because they had committed some sort of a crime or social transgression, such as even bumping into a white woman, or they could have been accused of attempted rape, anything, any kind of crime, or even such as not a crime. In cases involving criminal accusations, there were lynchings, and the lynching victims were not given the process of a trial, even. Those that did the lynchings were not charged with the killings of the criminals. How was Greensboro affected by Jim Crow? Particularly, there was one particular lynching in Greensboro proper, and it is believed to have occurred at the site of the Presbyterian Church of the Covenant, which is here in Greensboro. Teenager James Harrison was lynched in 1877 after being accused of attempted rape against a young white woman. There was another lynching also in Reidsville in 1881 of John Taylor for an alleged rape. Also during Jim Crow, the higher public education system began to grow in Greensboro. Bennett College was chartered in 1889 and in 1926 became a four-year college for women. And in 1957 became the first women's college for Blacks to be accredited by the Southern Association. In 1915, the Agricultural and Mechanical College became known as the Negro Agricultural and Technological College of North Carolina, the largest of its type in the nation at that time, of course, later becoming NCA&T. Also under the Jim Crow, the famous Woolworth sit-in, which happened February 1st, 1960. 4 African-American North Carolina A&T students, Ezell A. Blair, Franklin E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond, had a passive sit-in, and it sparked a youth-led movement throughout the South to challenge injustice and racial inequality. In Greensboro, hundreds of students, civil rights organizations, churches, and members of the community joined in a 6-month-long protest. They challenged the company's policy of racial discrimination by sitting at the lunch counter and later organizing an economic boycott of the store. Their defiance heightened many Americans' awareness of the racial social injustice and ultimately led to the desegregation of the F.W. Woolworth's lunch counter on July 25th in 1960. So you can see that the Jim Crow era did encompass a number of things, both nationwide and here in Greensboro.
And it's especially important to lament the lynchings. We've had some people in the Presbytery and some of our own members go on a pilgrimage journey to the lynching memorial, which is fairly new, and it's in Alabama, I believe. And pamphlets for these public spectacles of death would be passed out in the church pews on Sunday morning, and then someone would be hung and killed while people would eat a picnic after church. And it's important to remember that the people who were killed in these lynchings, yes, oftentimes they were accused of crimes, but the crimes were largely unfounded. It was more of killing people for sport than anything else. And it
became a spectacle.
And it was a spectacle of death. We see that today still. we're not talking about that now, but as you think of how badly people want to watch the videos of Black people who are killed in the streets and those sorts of things, like there's people want to watch those videos and they are showed over and over and over again, and that is still a public spectacle of Black death, which should not be happening.
For sure.
Mary and Keith, I think it's good for us to lift up at this point too that last week we included an article that was in the Greensboro News and Record, as well as a webinar from the Greensboro Historical Museum on the Eugene Hairston lynching, who is the African American that we know that was lynched here in Guilford County at the site that you mentioned, Mary. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to the webinar or read that article, I would highly encourage you to do that, and if possible to support this remembrance project and what it might mean for our city. And Keith, what you mentioned I think is so important too, the presbyteries pilgrimages to Alabama and also to Georgia. And we're hopeful to do that again next year, and we hope that people in our church will be a part of that. We also spent a year as a presbytery at the end of presbytery meetings. In particular, my memory was Graham and Salisbury. You had the opportunity after the presbytery meeting to walk together to the lynching sites that were close to both churches and have a service of lament at those. So those were, as you mentioned, important things for us to do as a Presbyterian, as people of faith.
And for this week, I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of a spoiler alert, I guess. We have a pilgrimage to the International Civil Rights Museum. Normally we announce these things at the end. One of the pilgrimages is to the International Civil Rights Museum. And in the museum, I'm not sure what they're doing with COVID protocols or anything like that, but whenever you get a chance to go in the museum and view it, there is an absolutely horrible room that has the pictures and recordings of these lynchings and these public deaths. And it is an incredibly hard room to walk through. But it shows just how horrible people can be, and it's sad and horrible and disgusting. And I don't think that we can reiterate that enough, or lament enough, or apologize enough for that horrible part of our history.
But Keith, it's one of those things that I don't want to say that you should see, but it really drives home how horrific this really was.
Well, we have a scriptural mandate to not look away from oppression, especially like the prophet Joel. God calls everybody to open their eyes and to look around at the destruction and oppression. So it is something we have to look at and reckon with. And we can't turn a blind eye to this part of history, which would be really easy to do, and something that we probably all want to do, but we cannot do.
Right.
Well, Donna, I think you were going to explain a little bit more about the sit-in movement, especially Bennett College's participation in that. The Bennett Bells often get overlooked.
Yes, I'd love to, Keith. One of the things that I enjoyed about this summer Storytime series that we did about the civil rights movement and how we can remember that and learn from it with our children was I had an opportunity to go over and visit Bennett College, and I did one of the stories of the sit-in movement for children on the steps of the chapel at Bennett. And we also, of course, had our Deconstructing Racism Part 1 course with Dr. Linda Brown, who is a retired professor of English and African American Studies at Bennett. And her book, The Bells of Liberty, with the subtitle Gender, Bennett College, and the Civil Rights Movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, is on our resource list this week. And if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, I highly encourage you to read it. We have several copies here at church, and you can also purchase it locally. But one of my favorite parts of the book is the section at the end where Linda actually interviews and documents remembrances from 50 of the Bennett Bells about their part in the Greensboro sit-in movement, how it not only impacted them at the time as young college women, but how it continued to impact them throughout their lives. And many of them recount in the book their continued work in social change and social activism. And so I just thought those stories were very powerful. And so I would encourage you to read those. Another thing that we've included this week is an interview with Dr. Linda Brown, and it's done by one of the book club leaders at the Center for Creative Leadership here in town. And she interviews Linda about the book, and Linda talks quite a bit about her aunt. So Linda was a student at Bennett College during the sit-in movements, and she was an active participant in the movement. But her aunt, Dr. Willa Player, was the president of Bennett College. And if it were not for her aunt, many parts of how Bennett participated probably would not have happened. Linda describes her aunt as a black steel magnolia. She said she was fearless, she was courageous. I mixed that with creative, which she probably had to be too. But she was also very quiet. She did not participate in the movement. She felt like that was a movement for the young people to continue. But she would get in her car, as Linda says, and drive slowly down Elm Street during the times of the demonstrations, wave to the Bennett Bells, encourage them, and continue to pray for them. She was very involved with their parents, who were very concerned about their daughters, but Dr. Player was one that reassured them that she was watching out for the girls. There's stories about how when the students from A&T and Bennett were put in jail for some of their demonstrating, many of the boys at A&T were actually, their parents went and got them out of jail. And I think Dr. Player was one that thought it was important that if the girls felt that they should stay, that they should be able to remain there. She talks about how the men and women during the time they were jailed would sing hymns back and forth to each other in the evenings to maintain their sense of solidarity through their faith. One of the things that you may or may not know is that the night before the sit-ins occurred, the meeting was at Bennett College. The Bennett Bells were very involved in all of the actions that took place before, during, and after the actual sit-in. They were very much involved in the leadership, even though they were not present the very first day. They were there the very next day and had a very significant part in the sit-in movement. The other thing that's significant to note is that Dr. Player is the one that invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to speak at Bennett College when many places in town, many large places that could have held him and held many people to hear him, refused to have him. So that was a significant part of, which was in 1958, which was a significant part also of the movement here in Greensboro. When people ask Dr. Linda Brown what they can do in regards to continuing the legacy of Bennett, she says, give money. And she also says, fight to have in our International Civil Rights Museum now more of acknowledgement of the role of the Bennett Bells and what they did as African American women to be a significant part of the sit-in movement. Remember, too, that Bennett is one of the 2 remaining historically Black women's colleges in the United States today. So we want to continue the legacy of the Bells and what they did here in Greensboro as a private religious college for young women.
Well, one of the big questions about this that we've been asking throughout our course is, what were we doing while this was going on in the community and in the world? And I'm going to talk just a little bit about Presbyterians in general, and then about what was going on at First Pres. And to put it rather plainly, it was a wild time to be a Presbyterian in the middle of the civil rights movement. If you don't know your Presbyterian history, it's quite a family tree of stuff mixing and people leaving. The joke is that while some places are like, I don't know if I should say this joke. The joke is that when Baptists get angry, they make another church. When Presbyterians get angry, they make another denomination. And that is the true for that stereotype of the Presbyterians is unfortunately true. So there were 2 churches. We talked about the split last week. There's a northern church and a southern church, and there were talks of them coming together. And so the southern church was the Presbyterian Church in the United States. The northern church was the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. And the Southern Church, which is something to be proud of because First Presbyterian was part of the Southern Church, was the first denomination in America to endorse the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board in 1954. The PCUS was on the front lines of saying that segregation is wrong and segregation is sin, and supporting desegregation and integration. But while the PCUS was making some of these more progressive movements and statements, it also had some of the most conservative people. And it was like a civil war within the PCUS. And it mattered where the General Assembly meeting was what type of thing would happen. So in 1954, we were the first denomination to endorse Brown versus Board. In 1967, the Southern Church was not able to pass its own version of the Confession of 1967, like the Northern Church did. Our version of the Confession of 67 was passed by the Northern Church. The Southern Church didn't get that passed. So it mattered where things were as to whether it would be a pro-segregation or against segregation meeting. And we eventually see that split with the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, shooting off from the Southern Church because of a lot of things, but one of them was desegregation of churches. They did not want to desegregate their churches, and a host of other things all coming together. So in 1983, the Southern Church and the Northern Church finally rejoined to make the Presbyterian Church USA, which is what we are right now. But it was in those talks that the most conservative people in the Southern Church decided to shoot off and make the Presbyterian Church in America and not join with the rest of the Northern and Southern Church in their reunion. If that didn't make sense, Wikipedia has a really good timeline chart that might clear things up. But at First Pres, we we were mainly silent during this stuff. We were known for not rocking the boat. And I'm going to read a quote from the book is called Civilities and Civil Rights. We're recommending that you can find it. I know that Scuppernong on Elm Street has it because that's where I bought my copy. I'm going to read a quote from it, and this is roughly 1955. And it says, "The lack of support for desegregation was most notable at First Presbyterian Church, Greensboro's most prestigious congregation. Attended by the heads of most major corporations as well as their executive officers, First Presbyterian could have provided a crucial lever for change had church leaders lined up in support of desegregation. Instead, an associate recalled, the minister of the church encouraged foot dragging and revealed his own distaste for desegregation by announcing that it was his duty to inform the congregation of the national church's stance on these issues. Looking back 15 years later, one Greensboro minister observed, a lot could have been done to get the business power structure behind what was taking place, but no one person really emerged as a leader. The potential for leadership was fantastic, but they all hung back. The greatest reason was just the desire to avoid conflict." And that is a rough quote to read about what was going on at First Presbyterian in the 50s specifically. Part of this week, we will encourage you to read some of the sermons from that time. We have two sermons from Dr. John Redhead, and then one sermon from Joseph Mullen. And I guess was Joseph Mullen a doctor too? So Dr. Joseph Mullen also. And the first sermon you'll read is from 1956 by Dr. Redhead, and I'll admit it's not great. In it, he talks about how the church has called for desegregation and therefore we will follow it, but then goes on to talk about how this decision does not mean that Black people and white people will have to have social interactions, or you won't have to be friends with Black people. And then goes on to talk about how racial intermarriage is unwise and should not happen. And so it's an interesting thing to watch to read how on one hand we are saying that to be segregated is sinful and the church should be the leaders in desegregating, and then to turn around and still support, I guess, private segregation. But in this, Redhead is a good example of the ways that people can change and the ways that First Presbyterian changed for the better. We will, in the second sermon from him, I think it's from 1968, it's a much better sermon. You can see that he has moved in his thinking, which means that First Presbyterian has likely moved in its thinking as well. And it's much more supportive of the civil rights movement. And then finally, the last sermon we will read is from Joseph Mullen, and it's in 1972, in which he has explicit support for desegregation of schools and encourages church members to work for desegregation. So while the first sermon is not great, it shows where First Presbyterian was as largely this moderate, sleeping, silent giant that could have done a lot, but it was too worried about rocking the boat. We're going to also assign for this week the Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And unfortunately, I think First Presbyterian at the time fits in this quote that he writes. And it is, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And even though Martin Luther King Jr. was writing this in 1963 to his white Alabama ministry colleagues, I think that by and large, First Presbyterian probably fell into this camp. I think that we eased our way out of it over the course of the civil rights movement, but we were often worried. We were more worried about order and upsetting the order than we probably were worried about establishing justice in our community. So those are some fun reading assignments, I guess. And then we also have a good thing to look at Dr. Redhead as an example of a human who is able to change and learn throughout his career. We have an article of him reflecting on his career and then on the passions and the work of his descendants, talking about how his support for the anti-racist work of his descendants, recognizing his own shortfalls in his career and how he's changed and how he's supportive of his descendants, pushing us into an even better and brighter future.
Keith, I think one of the things that hits me so much in that quote from Civilities and Civil Rights is that piece about the potential for leadership that First Presbyterian had because of where they stood in the community. And the piece about how so much of it was wrapped around this inability to, or their fear of creating conflict, which I think we've talked about in the church today, how important it is to move past that so that we can all come together. It takes all of us, as Jill often reminds us of, to move forward. We're in this together. And just that role at the time of the Black churches and the Black colleges in moving things forward during the civil rights movement, and how there were other churches involved. And for us, it was much more of the members of our church that were involved in the community. And what you described from the Civilities and Civil Rights is a very paternalistic role. We did good, and a lot of it in Greensboro, but was in a very paternalistic nature.
Right. And I think that it is important. This is one of the rules, actually, for our group agreements in our small groups. Understanding intent is different than reception or what actually happens. And I think that our people, by and large, had very good intentions, but benevolent paternalism is not the way to establish justice. That it may have been the best that they knew or the best that they knew how to do, but as Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in this, I lost where I was in the quote, but talking about you can't set another person's timeline for freedom or wait till it's a convenient time to talk about these things. And that's something that has been the response of many white people and many good-meaning white people to cries of injustice and cries for justice. Like, this is not a good time, or this is not the right way, when we would like to dictate how those things end up coming about, and it's that benevolent paternalism that is, while it is well-meaning, it is toxic and harmful. Well, I think we've gone a little bit over time. Thank you for staying with us. We hope to see you all at our week 4 session. We'll have plenty of talk about. There's a lot of homework this week. I'm sorry about that. But most of the reading is short. Our pilgrimages are to Bennett College, North Carolina A&T, the Civil Rights Museum, which was the Woolworths where the sit-in happened. And then there's one other, correct, Donna?
The Magnolia House.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there is a sign there yet, but the site of the lynching would be another possible pilgrimage site for folks as well.
And that is at the Presbyterian Church of the Covenant near UNCG.
Right there on Mendenhall, right directly across from the Ukirk House.
Okay.
Keith, would you like for me to end with that MLK prayer that we've used in our Zoom discussions?
I think that would be a great way to end today, Donna. So thank you, Donna, and thank you, Mary. And thank you, whoever's watching this, for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
This prayer from MLK Jr. is entitled, Shake Us from Our Slumber. Let us pray. When our eyes do not see the gravity of racial justice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes, O Lord. When out of fear we are frozen into inaction, give us a spirit of bravery, O Lord. When we try our best but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility, O Lord. When the chaos of this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity, O Lord. When it becomes easier to point fingers outwards, help us examine our own hearts, O Lord. God of truth, in your wisdom, enlighten us. God of hope, in your kindness, heal us. Creator of all, in your generosity, guide us. Racism breaks your heart, breaks our hearts for what breaks yours, O Lord. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever 2 or more are gathered. In our community, we are many different people, different places, different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasure of diversity among us. We pray this all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. See you all soon on the Zoom discussion.